may be seated. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Nevada State Finals competition of We the People. This is Unit 4. My name is David Byerman, and I just wrapped up my second term as Secretary of the Senate for the state of Nevada. We're here today with a group of great judges, and I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Ms. Peterson.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tammy Peterson. I'm an attorney here in Las Vegas. Started my career as a prosecutor in the Clark County DA's office and now do commercial and complex litigation.
My name is Angela Orr. I'm the Washoe County School District Special Studies Coordinator and a former We the People.
And my name is David Clark. I'm Chief Discipline Prosecutor for the State Bar of Nevada.
I'm here today for Unit 4, and I'd like to indicate we do have our timer here, and we'll be getting 1-minute notices for your presentation and 1 minute when you're asking our 10 minutes worth of follow-up questions. So for Unit 4, we've conferred amongst ourselves, and we've selected question number 2. Since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, there's been an increasing use by presidents of executive orders and signing statements to establish national policy. To what extent, if any, does this practice violate the principle of separation of powers contained within the Constitution? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the use of executive orders and signing statements? And should the president be able to refuse to carry out a law he or she believes to be unconstitutional? Why or why not? You may begin.
In Baron de Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, he wrote, "When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty." Through unilateral presidential directives, such as executive orders and signing statements, presidents intermingle legislating and executing, creating a constitutional breakdown of both separation of powers and checks and balances. Although executive orders are not statutory law, the 1960 case of Armstrong versus United States determined they hold effects, and thus legally and constitutionally hold the full force of the law, giving the president unilateral authority to establish national policy.
Executive orders in themselves do not violate separation of powers because they are constitutional within the president's vested power to execute statutory laws with discretion. However, they do threaten separation of powers when the unilateral directives go largely unchecked, which is what we have seen since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. While there are checks on these actions, such as guidelines in statutory laws, the courts, political factors, and rescinded by future executive orders, they are seldom used, granting the executive the power to legislate largely unchecked.
Congress has been passive, and between 1973 and 1997, they have only proposed 37 laws aiming at overturning executive orders, and only 3 have passed. The courts have also tended to side with the president, and of over 4,000 executive orders issued between 1942 and 1996, only 86 have been challenged, and the president wins 86% of the time. Furthermore, while signing statements do not change statutes, they can affect the execution of laws within an administration, essentially allowing the president to define federal policy.
Signing statements have also gone largely unchecked, and the courts tend to side with the presidents. In the 1989 case, United States versus Story, the Second Circuit even cited President Ronald Reagan's signing statement as significant in the decision because it was involved in the negotiation and compromise of the legislation. When Congress fails to use their checks and concedes legislative influence to the president, they degrade separation of powers by allowing the president to exercise a significant role in establishing national policy.
The increasing use of executive orders and signing statements has primarily resulted from presidents' desires to advance ambitious agendas, as well as to respond to crises caused by legislative delay or gridlock. President Barack Obama's recent order on immigration responded to the deportation crisis caused by congressional inaction on the issue. In this case, the executive order was advantageous because a great deal of lives depended on the decision and needed a response as soon as possible.
It was also pointed out in an interview with Stephen Colbert that President Obama would prefer for Congress to resolve the issue by passing a bill, but until then he must respond with his order. Former Presidential Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel said that presidents would often use executive orders to lead by example and force the legislative hand. Furthermore, signing statements are useful for presidents to structure the executive implementation of a statute. However, there are limited external checks on these statements, and if unchecked, they can allow presidents to issue line-item vetoes and ignore statutory laws.
The disadvantage of unilateral actions is the fact that they have gone largely unchecked, creating a breakdown of checks and balances. They allow for the will of a single man to control much of the national policy and federal government. The president should not be able to refuse to carry out a law he believes to be unconstitutional. The executive is granted the power to veto bills he has legal or constitutional issues with. However, if his veto is overridden by a congressional supermajority, He is required by the Take Care Clause to faithfully execute the law.
This veto power should not be abused by line item vetoes, which were ruled unconstitutional in the 1998 case, Clinton versus New York. While signing statements are useful for presidents to provide guidelines within statutorily granted administrative discretion, it should not be abused as a disguised line item veto, allowing the president to ignore unfavorable provisions of law. To allow the president the discretion to ignore law would not only undermine checks and balances and separation of powers, but popular sovereignty and the will of the American people. Thank you.
And my question actually kind of picks up right where you left off. And it has to do with the number of signing statements that we're seeing from different presidents. President George W. Bush in his first term had 112 signing statements. In his second term, 50. President Obama just 22. So my question to you is, do you think that variation in the number of signing statements is reflective of a difference in philosophy, the sign of the times in which they governed, or is there some third explanation?
One potential explanation of why so many signing statements may be issued is the growing use of omnibus bills with legislature. With more omnibus bills, which includes different types of legislation that are often unrelated, presidents may agree with certain provisions and disagree with certain unrelated provisions, so signing statements are very useful in that instance.
I don't think there's necessarily a pattern between presidents. I just think when it's necessary, they have to make signing statements. An example of this would be in the 2012 Defense Authorization Act. President Obama took a signing statement because within a bill that was an omnibus bill that had thousands of pages, one of his lawyers found that within it said that Congress shall be able to obtain or to detain and to take away someone's habeas corpus. This obviously should not be able to happen. So the president issued a signing statement counteracting that and saying that he wouldn't necessarily enforce this part of it. So I think it's just when it's necessary, and it's not necessarily when it's the amount, or it doesn't pertain to each president. It's just whenever they have to.
However, President Bush did claim that his increasing use of signing statements was due to the fact that he believed Congress was, in certain provisions of law, overstepping their power and taking away from executive power. So in that sense, I would agree that it has to do with the president's philosophy and how they feel about their power as well.
And adding on to Keanu's point, I think it's very circumstantial with the times that are going on with President Bush and the terrorist attack of 9/11. The Congress, along with the president, needed to respond, and with those signing statements, he was able to complement anything that Congress could do.
So is expanding the president's power in those times where it's really necessary, is it important to give the president more power with executive orders and signing statements when it's necessary?
It is important to give the president certain leeway and discretion during certain emergencies, such as military invasion or even economic crises. However, in the case of Yakins versus the United States, the Supreme Court tried to establish a delegation doctrine that when legislation does grant discretion to the president, it has to present a clear legislative objective and clear goals and guidelines that the president can and cannot follow.
Adding on to Wyatt's point, with the Yakis versus United States, in the same sense, the Panama cases decided that if the legislative gives the president power, but it is not restrictive and it's not very specific in what they're supposed to do, it's not constitutional. Because within the president's vesting powers and the legislative vesting powers, there's not the discrepancy to be able to grant the certain vesting powers of the legislative branch to the executive.
One of the other questions I'd like to ask is about the president's powers to nominate and appoint people to offices, whether they're administrative offices or judicial offices. But why does Article 2 require the president to openly nominate candidates he proposes? What purposes do these open nominations serve?
What do you mean by open nomination?
Why does there have to be an open nomination? If he has the power to appoint, why can't he just appoint who he likes in particular federal agencies to go through and execute the powers that he has already?
Well, he doesn't have the power to appoint whoever he wishes. He does require the advice and consent of the Senate. He does require that a majority of the Senate approve who he appoints, and that's an important check on the states for executive power.
Also, it's very important to check against the president to make sure that he isn't overstepping his bounds, which can come into issue with partisan politics if he is appointing someone simply for the fact that they're of the same party as he is.
also open nominations would allow for the citizens of the United States to be aware of who our president is appointing and putting into certain leadership positions.
Ms. Orr?
The president's popularity and authority problems tend to be particularly acute in the last 2 years of his second term in office. Some reformers believe it would be better if presidents served just one 6-year term. What do you think about that proposal?
Having 2 potential terms is very advantageous because it allows the president to consider things like approval ratings in case he wants to get elected twice. So if you give him one 6-year term, he may, towards the end, do whatever he wants if he thinks that there's no possibility for re-election. So the possibility for re-election is a sense of check on the president not to take radical action.
I would agree with my colleague Wyatt. I like to compare the end of a president's term almost to senioritis of a senior in high school. Because if the president knows that there's no chance of being elected again, there's nothing really to check him on whether or not he feels the public would agree with his opinions.
I would agree with that and say it's almost an incentive to do better and to maintain that public opinion and what the public's saying on social media websites or just in general, what they think about the president.
Lastly, I wanted to add that the power of, or the ability for a president to run for 2 terms also gives them the power to bring out this full 8 years and see through legislation that they may see as necessary. Going back to President Roosevelt and his extended presidency, even though it was unprecedented and he was in the executive position for so long, he was also very active and he did a lot to help the crises that the nation was facing at the time.
Mr. Clark?
Given the almost explosion since FDR's term of the federal bureaucracy, agencies, bureaus, commissions, in every aspect of our life, every aspect of our commerce, all answerable to the president, all answerable to the executive branch, is there any limit left on the president's power? How can that expansive bureaucratic power be limited, and should it be?
The check on this would largely be up to Congress and their ability to be cohesive in checking the president. Congress has the ability to conduct investigations into what the executive branch is doing. For example, recently the Senate Intelligence Committee conducted an investigation on what was going on in Guantanamo Bay, and they released an intelligence report. So Congress could increase investigation into what the president is doing and conduct oversight.
Also, there's so many checks on the presidential power. From the case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, Justice Jackson's concurrence created a system for evaluating the relationship between Congress and the president. This has later come up in cases such as Rizal v. Bush, where it was decided that the power for the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and due process for inmates at Guantanamo Bay was not constitutional. After that, the Military Commissions Act was passed in order to get around that decision and allow President Bush to still uphold his wishes with inmates at Guantanamo Bay.
I would agree with both my colleagues that it is Congress's responsibility to check the president on expansion of presidential power, mostly because the judicial branch has no authority until things are brought to the branch themselves, to the courts. And so it is the responsibility of the people and the federal government to bring those issues to the courts.
Do you think that the fact that we still have these executive orders and signing statements happening with such regularity means that implicitly the Supreme Court has determined that this doesn't violate separation of powers?
The Supreme Court upheld in a case that it doesn't violate separation of powers as long as the president is issuing orders that can be rationally implied within the discretion that Congress writes within their statutory law. So Congress cannot be super specific in what they do. Well, they can be, but it's a lot easier to allow the president some sort of discretion in how he implements certain laws. So in that way, executive orders are advantageous to implement laws.
Adding on to Wyatt's point, with the power of the executive of a single person, there also are some things that his discretion alone can be quicker and it can be more responsive. John Locke, in his second treatise on civil government, said that it was important for the president to be able to respond so quickly to emergencies or any sort of action within the government.
Agreeing with Sophia's point, I believe that in times of crisis, the country does want to look to a face, that face being the president. For example, the recent crisis in Ebola, it was best that the president made the executive order regarding issuing or appointing an Ebola czar because of the fact that he could get it done much more quickly and efficiently and much more responsibly, which was needed in the situation than the legislature could.